Donc je voulais juste dire deux mots avant de passer la parole à Jean-Pierre Criqui. Pour certains d'entre nous, c'est le troisième jour de travail autour du dernier livre de Michael Fried, Why Photography Matters as Art as Never Before. Ce sont très journées très intenses de discussion autour d'un groupe de recherche mixte, pour moitié formé d'étudiants, d'anciens étudiants de l'école des Beaux-arts de Lyon, et pour moitié de doctorants de l'école des hautes études en sciences sociales. Alors, cette recherche, elle s'oriente vers des problèmes centrés autour des relations entre l'art contemporain et les temps de l'histoire. Ce n'est pas maintenant le moment d'approfondir cette perspective, puisque nous avons un conférencier. Je vais juste faire circuler parmi vous, pour ceux qui ne le connaîtraient pas, l'ouvrage qui recueille la publication des 4 premières années de notre recherche, qui s'appelait La construction du réel dans l'art contemporain. Donc, j'espère qu'il va me revenir. Donc, j'ai cette workshop séminaire a été organisé donc autour de Michael Fried et de 𝙩𝙚𝙢𝙥𝙨, qui est encore ici parmi nous, qui nous a présenté son travail, qui est d'ailleurs l'un des photographes dont Michael Fried parle dans son livre. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons été rejoints par Jean-Pierre Criqui, qui nous fait donc l'amitié de participer à ce travail, et aussi sur notre demande de Bernard Rudiger et de moi d'introduire Michael Fried, qui donc je lui laisse la parole. Je rappelle simplement que Jean-Pierre Criqui est rédacteur en chef des cahiers du Musée national d'art moderne, critique d'art, et qu'il a beaucoup travaillé sur la photographie contemporaine, entre autres. Donc merci beaucoup Jean-Pierre, et merci Michael encore une fois.
Merci Giovanni, bonjour à tous. Je voulais dire que j'étais très content d'être là ce soir et remercier Yves Robert, Giovanni Carreri, Bernard Rudiger de m'avoir convié à vous rejoindre aujourd'hui et puis de m'avoir demandé de faire cette petite introduction, ce petit exercice de présentation de Michael Fried, qui d'ailleurs n'a pas besoin d'être présenté comme tous les gens qu'on souvent, toutes les figures célèbres qu'on vous demande de présenter, parce que Michael, Dieu merci, n'est pas entièrement traduit en français, mais un certain nombre de ses livres, et la majorité, sont traduits. J'ai vu qu'ils étaient ici à la bibliothèque, bien en évidence. La place du spectateur, Courbet, Manet, contre la théâtralité, et puis un certain nombre d'articles en revue depuis toujours. Donc, répondant à une sollicitation de Giovanni, je ne vais pas présenter Michael Fried, parce que je sais qu'un certain nombre d'entre vous ont lu ses livres, le connaissent, et puis que ceux qui ne l'auraient pas encore fait le feront très prochainement. Mais en réponse à ce que Giovanni m'avait demandé, je vais essayer de dire quelques mots sur la manière dont j'ai, moi, rencontré le travail de Michael Fried. C'est un peu mon Michael Fried, si je puis dire, dont je vais parler quelques instants devant vous, parce qu'il se trouve que je connais Michael, nous sommes amis depuis quelques années seulement, mais intellectuellement, je le connais depuis très très longtemps. Je le connais, à vrai dire, depuis l'origine de mes études d'histoire de l'art, et ma rencontre avec Michael Fried remonte à ce petit volume en collection 10-18. À l'époque, c'était la revue d'esthétique qui était publiée en poche, époque bénie, 1976, revue d'esthétique numéro 1, ça s'appelait Peindre, et moi j'ai acheté ça en commençant mes études d'histoire de l'art 2 ans plus tard, en 78-79. C'était déjà en solde d'ailleurs, je me souviens. C'est bon, la revue d'esthétique n'a pas marché très très longtemps en poche, mais c'était une entreprise salutaire et importante. Et à l'intérieur, et moi j'étais un freshman, comme on dirait en anglais, j'étais un bleu, rookie, un nouveau. Et j'ai acheté ce livre parmi les premiers livres, mes premiers livres d'étudiants de première année. Et je dois dire que bon, je l'ai apporté, c'est un peu une relique. Le pelliculage s'en va, les papiers s'est décollé. Le papier s'est décollé surtout là où il y a un article de Michael, parce que je n'ai pas tellement lu je suis moins revenu sur les autres parties du livre. et puis la couverture notamment, bon, voilà, des choses comme ça. C'est toute une époque de la pensée française, mais c'est aussi toute une époque des débuts d'un dialogue transatlantique avec la pensée américaine critique. Et il y avait dans ce petit volume 10-18, qui est peut-être ici dans la bibliothèque, ou vous trouverez dans les bibliothèques, un long texte d'un auteur que moi je ne connaissais pas, en 1978-79, qui s'appelait Michael Fried, et c'était un texte qui était intitulé « Trois peintres américains », présenté par Louis Marin, le grand historien de l'art sémiologue, que je découvrais et lisais aussi en même temps à la même époque, qui introduisait Michael en posant assez bien quelques jalons, notamment par rapport à Merleau-Ponty, la phénoménologie, et puis venait ensuite, dans une traduction de Françoise Toulig-Marin, l'épouse de Louis Marin, ce long texte, qui est de loin le plus long texte du recueil, qui s'appelle « Trois peintres américains ». C'était la traduction, en fait, ça avait déjà une bonne dizaine d'années de décalage par rapport à la production, parce que ce texte date de 1965, « Three American Painters ». C'était un texte de catalogue qui était consacré à trois peintres américains, comme son titre l'indique, à savoir Kenneth Noland, 𝙩𝙬𝙙𝙙𝙪 et Frank Stella. Et ce texte tranchait de manière résolue par rapport à son environnement, dans lequel il y a d'ailleurs certaines choses intéressantes dans ce livre, c'est pas ça que je veux dire, mais le ton m'a tout de suite frappé et m'a tout de suite retenu. Et c'est un livre, c'est un texte, c'est presque un format d'un livre, c'est un article d'une centaine de pages. C'était l'unique texte de ce catalogue de 65, d'une expo à Oxford, à Cambridge, aux États-Unis, hein, c'est ça, Harvard. Et ce qui m'a frappé, c'était à la fois, je dirais, une espèce de rigueur de l'argument. Moi, je dois dire que j'avais commencé les études d'histoire de l'art en venant de la musique et de la philosophie, qui étaient mes deux intérêts principaux auparavant. Et je dois dire que j'ai été surpris de trouver dans le travail, dans le texte de Michael Fried, une rigueur d'analyse qui pouvait me faire penser à ce qu'était l'analyse musicologique, que je connaissais par exemple, comment on analyse une partition, comment on s'attache à un objet musical quand on étudie la musique. Et puis aussi, du côté de la philosophie, un maniement des concepts, une espèce de rigueur, et en même temps une lucidité, une clarté très très grande. Enfin, on était très très loin d'une espèce de verbiage plus ou moins insensé qui a toujours prévalu dans l'art contemporain. À l'époque, c'était incarné par des gens comme Pierre Restany ou 𝙩𝙚𝙢𝙥𝙯, et ça continue par être incarné par d'autres aujourd'hui. Et on était aussi très très loin, je dirais, de construction théorique psychanalytique à la française ou plus obscur. Je veux dire, on était, pour le dire en un mot, très très loin de tout ce qui prévalait à l'époque en esthétique. Donc ce texte était vraiment une espèce de modèle, à vrai dire. Enfin, moi je l'ai pris comme ça en tant qu'étudiant. Et puis j'ai été très frappé par, bien que c'était un texte sur ces trois peintres dont j'ai cité les noms, ce qui m'a frappé, ce qui m'a retenu, c'était les passages sur Colloque, puisque c'est les premières choses que j'ai lues sur Colloque que j'ai trouvées éclairante, analytique et parlante. Il y a de longues digressions. Michael parle aussi de Kooning. Enfin, il met en situation. Il faut dire que quand ce texte a été écrit en 65, c'est pas faire une indiscrétion que de dire que notre auteur avait 26 ans. Hein. Donc c'est le texte de quelqu'un qui était jeune quand il l'a écrit, et qu'en 65, Pollock était mort il n'y avait même pas 10 ans. Donc c'était quasiment un peintre contemporain, Pollock. Et il était très 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 proche. Donc voilà, je voulais dire ça. Et puis il y avait une espèce de posture, je dirais de sérieux du commentaire qui était assez frappant, et en même temps une manière très très américaine, très propre à Michael, mais qu'on aurait trouvé aussi dans les meilleurs moments de Clement Greenberg, de s'en remettre à son jugement et de s'en remettre à l'expérience de l'objet, à l'expérience du tableau en l'occurrence. Il y avait une phrase qui m'avait beaucoup marqué à l'époque, je l'ai retrouvée immédiatement en rouvrant cette ruine. Michael disait, je la cite en français telle qu'elle est traduite là, « Les jugements commencent et s'achèvent dans l'expérience. Si l'on ne sent pas que le déjeuner sur l'herbe de Manet, la leçon de piano de Matisse ou Autumn Rhythm de Pollock sont de grands tableaux, aucun argument critique ne peut le faire. » Bon, ça, je crois que c'était assez éclairant. Alors, il se trouve que j'ai, en poursuivant la voie de l'histoire de l'art, j'ai retrouvé assez vite Michael Fried intellectuellement à travers un groupe de gens, et je ne connaissais pas Michael, on s'est rencontrés il y a quelques années seulement, mais un groupe de gens auxquels j'ai été très lié, que j'ai connu très très tôt, à la fin, enfin au début des années 80, qui étaient les gens autour de la revue Macula et de la maison d'édition du même nom en France, à savoir Jean Clay et Yves Alain-Bois, qui étaient les deux fondateurs de Macula, et puis une personnalité qui était un peu la tête de pont américaine, qui était Rosalind Krauss. Et Rosalind Krauss, un des premiers textes que j'ai lu d'elle et que j'ai traduit plus tard dans le volume qui s'appelle L'originalité de l'avant-garde et autres mythes modernistes, c'est un texte qui s'appelle Un regard sur le modernisme, un texte de 72, où en ouverture elle évoque Michael Fried de manière très très frappante. Je ne vais pas lire ce passage, je vous renvoie tout simplement au texte lui-même en français, vous le trouverez, c'est ici à la bibliothèque, je n'en doute pas. Mais simplement, c'est une petite anecdote où elle est au musée avec Michael Fried, et puis soudain, un étudiant s'approche d'eux et montre un stellar et leur demande, il demande à Michael Fried, qu'y a-t-il de si bon là-dedans? Et là, je cite Rosalind Krauss, Michael se tourna vers lui et lui dit « Écoutez, dit-il doucement, certains jours, Stella se rend au Metropolitan Museum. Il s'assied devant les Velasquez et les regarde, complètement époustouflé pendant des heures. Après quoi, il rentre à son atelier. Ce qu'il aimerait par-dessus tout, c'est peindre comme Velasquez. Mais il a conscience de l'impossibilité d'une telle option, alors il peint des bandes. » Ça, c'est un moment, je veux dire, important en tout cas pour moi, parce que ça m'a, à la même époque, je dois dire, comme tout étudiant français, je lisais Roland Barthes, et ça a immédiatement résonné avec une chose qu'écrivait Barthes au même moment, et dans un texte sur Réquichaud, qui s'appelle Réquichaud et son corps, qui est maintenant dans l'Objet l'Obtus, le recueil de Barthes. Et à propos d'être moderne, Barthes écrit « Être moderne, c'est savoir ce qui n'est plus possible ». Et il m'a semblé que les deux se raccordaient immédiatement, parce que Frank Stella, qui voulait être Velasquez et qui, pour être Velasquez, devait faire tout autre chose que peindre du Velasquez et du coup peigner des bandes, ce qui lui donnait une chance de rentrer dans le panthéon de la peinture, c'était évidemment une autre façon de dire ce qu'avait dit Barthes lorsqu'il disait à propos de Réquichaud, être moderne, c'est savoir ce qui n'est plus possible. Donc, je dirais que c'est la figure de Michael Fried et certains moments de sa pensée, moi, m'ont toujours accompagné. C'est quelqu'un que j'ai lu au fil des années. Et puis, ce qui m'a beaucoup surpris aussi, c'est que, alors, vous le savez, Michael Fried est l'auteur, sans doute, de ce qu'on peut qualifier de l'article de critique d'art le plus célèbre du demi-siècle passé, qui est Art and Objecthood, qui est apparu en 67 dans Art Forum. On peut dire que c'est une polémique contre le minimalisme et en faveur d'un certain type de peinture et de sculpture, comme celle de Caro à l'époque. Et je crois que bon, c'est devenu, ça me semble être, si j'avais un prix à décerner de l'article de critique d'art le plus connu, ce serait celui-là dans les dernières décennies. Donc, c'est vrai que moi, j'ai pas toujours été je n'ai pas forcément suivi ces positions-là, parce que mes voix m'ont conduit à travailler sur des gens comme Robert Smithson ou des gens comme ça qui, effectivement, étaient des adversaires théoriques évidents de Michael, mais j'ai toujours lu ce qu'il écrivait à la suite de cette espèce de satori initiale, d'épiphanie, comme aurait dit Barthes. Et une chose qui m'a surpris, c'était que d'abord, après avoir été critique d'art et écrit sur ces artistes contemporains, il s'est tourné vers le passé. Il a écrit des livres sur la peinture du XVIIIe siècle, sur la peinture du XIXe siècle. Donc il a fait cette espèce d'archéologie du modernisme en construisant toute une théorie qui lui est personnelle de l'absorption de la théâtralité, mais qui était déjà présente dans Art and Objecthood dans l'article de 1967. Et puis, pour en arriver très vite à aujourd'hui et lui laisser la parole, quand je l'ai rencontré il y a quelques années, c'était à l'École normale supérieure à Paris, où il venait parler de la photographie, et là, je me suis aperçu que cette personne que je connaissais, dont j'avais entendu parler depuis très longtemps, puisqu'il faut dire que Michael est la personne qui a fait venir Yves Alain Bois aux États-Unis, qui l'a embauché à Johns Hopkins University, qui lui a donné son premier poste. Donc je savais par tous ces gens que je connaissais très personnellement à Paris, qui était aussi Michael Fried en tant que personne, et la générosité, le rôle qu'il avait pu avoir par rapport à certains d'entre eux. Mais j'ai constaté que après l'avoir lu sur Courbet, Manet et Greuze, il s'intéressait à Gursky, Jeff Wall, Thomas Struth ou des artistes comme ça. Et c'était une grande surprise. Moi, une des premières choses qu'on a faites ensemble après s'être rencontrés, c'est aller voir le film Zidane de Douglas Gordon et Philippe Parreno, ce qui était aussi quelque chose d'un peu inattendu pour moi. C'était une suggestion de Michael qui a commenté ce film de manière tout à fait éclairante et éblouissante, selon moi. Et puis, voilà, je veux dire, je continue maintenant en tant qu'amicalement aussi, et non plus seulement intellectuellement, à suivre ce qu'il fait. Je trouve que le livre sur la photographie est tout à fait passionnant et tout à fait inattendu, et tout à fait quelque chose qui propose des vues qu'on n'aurait pas pu attendre forcément de Michael Fried. Il nous surprend à chaque fois, à chaque livre, par chaque objet, chaque nouvel objet qu'il se choisit. Il me racontait il y a peu qu'il travaille en ce moment avec Charles Ray, qui est aussi quelqu'un, un immense artiste, mais qui n'est pas forcément quelqu'un qu'on s'attendrait à trouver parmi les objets d'intérêt de Michael Fried. Et je dirais, pour paraphraser Roland Barthes, que ce que me démontre Michael Fried, c'est que si être moderne, c'était savoir ce qui n'était plus possible en 1965, être critique ou historien de l'art aujourd'hui, c'est ce que Michael démontre, c'est savoir que tout est encore possible. Voilà. Merci pour ça.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Pierre. C'est très, très généreux. I'm going to speak in English, but if we have some questions afterwards, I'm happy to take them in French. And I always understand compliments to me when they're in French. I have no problem with that. I won't even, if there were more time, I would return the compliment in many ways and tell you how we met, but I won't. So what I'm going to try to do today is, in a way, impossible. And I'm going to be speaking from slides that I'm going to show you. I'm going to try to give a kind of, I don't know, a tour d'horizon of the book. And some of it will be coherent and some of it may not be coherent. But I want to try to give some idea of how the argument in the book works. So I'm beginning by showing you a photograph by Jeff Wall, a very leading photographer of the last 30 years. Most of you, all of you will know this. He lives in Vancouver. And the works I'm going to show you now are light boxes, right? They are transparencies mounted on the wall with fluorescent lights behind them. And this is a work of his. It would be easy to teach, to give a number of lectures on Wall's work. But I want to begin with a work called Adrian Walker, Artist, Copying a Specimen in the Department of Anatomy, the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, 1993. It was a work that I saw in the mid-1990s, shortly after it was made. And I explained this in the seminars that I was teaching with Luc Delahaye, with Giovanni Carreri, with Bernard. I was not, during a whole lot of the time when let's call it the new art photography was coming into being from the late 1970s on, I was not one of those art historians or art critics in the world who were completely aware of what was happening. Someone like Jean-Pierre was infinitely more au courant with everything as it was happening. And I really started to wake up to what was happening, to what had been happening in the, I would say, around 1990. And this particular work made a big impression on me. It struck me because it seemed to me so close to works that I had studied and written about and that were important to me in 18th century French painting. And I'm going to show you a work right now, and then we'll go back to the Jeff Wall, Giovanni, if that's okay. So let's go to the next work. This is a work by, of course, Chardin, a great French painter. And this is a work from some point in the mid-1730s. It's at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And I talk about this work in my book, Absorption and Theatricality, which is translated as La Place du Spectateur, in terms of the impression that we get from the boy that he is completely absorbed, absorbé, in what he is doing. Which in this case is, if the picture is called the Card Castle, Le Château de Cartes, but it's not a card castle, it's more that he's taken these cards and he's folded them and he's making a kind of palisade out of them. But we're meant to feel, this is my claim, we are meant to feel, the spectator is meant to feel that he is completely caught up in what he is doing. And if one goes back to the middle of the 18th century, if one goes back to the 1750s and 60s, and one reads the writing about painting at that time, in particular, the absolutely great writing by the best art critic that there has ever been, the philosophe Denis Diderot. And if one reads Diderot, both his theoretical writings on the theater, on the stage, and then the salon, which begin in 1759, 59, 61, 63, then tremendous pieces of criticism in 1765 and 1767. You can see from the text, and then reading the texts and looking at paintings together, you can see that there emerges in the 1750s and 60s in France a new demand on painting, a new demand that painting present us with figures who seem to be completely caught up, completely engagé, absorbé in what they are doing, and therefore necessarily unaware of anything else, including le spectateur devant le tableau. Okay? The great quality that they're after is absorption, and absorption, what goes with it is a kind of oubli de soi. And these are the terms that are used. It's a sort of paradox that emerges, which I can phrase this way: only if the painter is able to show us figures who seem to be so caught up in what they are doing in the plane of the painting that they are unaware of being beheld, only then will the beholder be stopped and held and gripped by the painting. If, on the other hand, the beholder is made to feel that the figures in the painting are not completely absorbed, but only trying to seem absorbed, trying to appear absorbed, trying to impress the viewer with their absorption, that is unbearable, and those figures are seen as théâtrales. And they are seen not as showing real expression, but as showing mere grimace. And they are not seen as naive, which is the term of highest praise, but they are seen as maniérés, which is the worst thing you can possibly be. Maniéré is to act in order to appear for someone. Anyone familiar with the writing in France in the middle of the 18th century will also see how close this is to Rousseau in something like the Lettres d'Alembert sur les spectacles. Okay? It's not just Diderot and it's not just painting, but it's a desire at that moment for a new kind of effect of authenticity in art. And the larger claim that I make in La Place du Spectateur, but also in the books that come afterwards, is that this demand for this kind of appearance of authenticity becomes absolutely central to advanced painting in France from the middle of the 18th century on into the 19th century. Though it becomes harder and harder for artists to achieve it, until finally with Manet in the 1860s and the generation of Manet, there's a way in which the impossibility, to use that word again, of this project becomes apparent, and the painting in a way turns and faces and addresses and strikes the beholder in a new way. And that is the beginning of modernism in painting, but at the same time, modernism itself has to try to find ways not to be théâtral. That's a very, very, very short version of a much longer argument. But all of that is in play, is in place already in this picture. I mean, if we had more time, I would talk to you about that drawer in the foreground that comes out towards us and has these two cards in it. One card faces us. That's like the surface of the painting. The other card faces away, shows us a blank back. And that is like the state of mind of the boy, which is, as it were, close to us. Now, Giovanni, can we go back to the Jeff Wall? So what struck me looking at the Wall, and then in reading interviews with Wall afterwards, and then talking with him as I came to know him in the next years, it turns out to be the case that Wall, in a picture like this, is in fact interested in the idea of absorption, in the idea of depicting a figure who can be seen as absorbed in what he's doing, and therefore, as Jeff says, unaware, as seemingly unaware of the construction of the picture or the beholder standing before it, seemingly unaware. But if you look closely at this picture, and I hope you can, I hope the projection is good enough, you will also see that Wall has done something very subtle. He has not shown us this artist, Adrian Walker, actually drawing his drawing, which is something that Chardin would probably have done. He has not shown us this artist actually absorbed in what he's doing. He's chosen another kind of moment. And Wall, in one of his interviews, describes the moment as follows. He says, there really was an artist named Adrian Walker, and he really made the drawing that I show in this photograph. And he made it in that laboratory, just as I said. And there must have been, there may have been, there was probably a moment in the course of his work on that drawing, which was like this moment, and he describes this as saying, the drawing is finished, and the artist, Adrian Walker, is able to compare the drawing with the specimen of the severed arm that is in front of him. He is able to compare it. In other words, he does not say, there was a moment when Adrian Walker was himself completely absorbed in compare. Do you see what I mean? If the more closely we look, the more we can see that this is a work that is meant to evoke the idea of something like absorption without actually showing us the figure in the painting unmistakably in the grip of absorption. Also, because it's a photograph, we are aware, whether or not we think this consciously or not, that of course this person, let's say call him Adrian Walker because it is Adrian Walker in the photograph, could not have been unaware of Jeff Wall making the photograph. This is not a photograph that was made secretly by Jeff Wall sneaking into the room, holding a Leica, a quick camera, taking a quick picture and running out of the room before Adrian Walker knew he was there. On the contrary, as Wall also makes clear, this was a picture made with the cooperation of Adrian Walker, who posed for him in this way. The project of just taking the photographs that went into this photograph it certainly took days. It could even have taken 10 days. It could have taken 2 weeks. There may have been computer work on the photograph afterwards. In other words, this is a picture that it represents a kind of performance by Adrian Walker, working together with Wall to make a picture that looks as if he's absorbed, but nevertheless doesn't look as if he's completely absorbed. In other words, what I'm trying to capture here is something of the complexity of a picture like this, as simple as it looks, precisely with respect to its relation to the viewer. And I want to describe that relation you could say, on the one hand, there is a desire to make a picture that does not seem théâtral, that seems even anti-théâtral, absorbed, but at the same time, that acknowledges, that would be the verb I would want to use. I don't know exactly how this would play in French, but in English it would be acknowledges the fact that the picture is constructed, that it is not a candid photograph, and that it is, in the end, made to be beheld. The term I use for this throughout the book is to be seenness, sort of pour être vu. Ite, something like that. Huh? And my claim throughout the book is that all the photographers I'm talking about in this book are involved in something like that double structure of working with a relation to the spectator that in one sense wants to be not théâtral, but wants to, nevertheless, feels compelled to acknowledge the fact that all these pictures are made to be beheld. Let me put it another way. Around 1977, 1978, 1980, something happens in art photography in Europe, in North America. And what happens, and the French critic Jean-François Chevrier has written very well about this, is suddenly photographers are trying to make photographs that are larger than ever before. They're using color. Jeff Wall is one of them. The French photographer Jean-Marc Bustamante is another. In Düsseldorf, shortly, this will be the case with Thomas Roof. I mean, he's already starting to make portraits of his friends that are frontal, deadpan, passport-style photographs. They're not large yet, but they will become large very soon. And then Chevrier says something else that's very interesting. He calls this the rise of le tableau fond in art photography. And Bustamante calls all his early photographs tableau, and he frames them. Chevrier says it's not just a matter of size. It is also, and I would say more importantly, a matter of being made for the wall, to hang on the wall. And something is more is at stake in that than simply saying, well, to be like paintings. I don't think so. I don't think so. But they hang on the wall. And to that, I want to add a third aspect of this. The moment photographs start to be made for the wall, they necessarily engage in a way they never did before with the relation between the photograph and the viewer. And we see a version of that already in this photograph. May I have let's go to have the Chardin, and then we'll go past the Chardin. To just show you another more, I would say, spectacular photograph of walls, about 12 feet wide. Morning cleaning, Mies van der Rohe Pavilion, Barcelona, 1999. And this is a photograph made, as the title says, in this extraordinary modernist building, actually a rebuilt modernist building in Barcelona with glass walls. The scene is around 7 o'clock in the morning. The dominant action in the painting is this light streaming in through the glass wall at the right, striking the onyx doré wall at the left. And beyond the area of light, we see the window cleaner, who is bent over, and we could say absorbed in fastening on the head of his mop squeegee with which he's cleaning the windows behind him. They're already streaked with water, with soap suds, and so on. And then beyond those windows is a pool of water, and rising from the pool to the left, can you see, is a statue by Georg Kolbe of a naked woman called Dawn, Morgenröte. And we sense something like the absorption of the window cleaner in what he's doing. We sense it not just because he seems to be engaged in doing this thing, but he also seems to be unaware, as if unaware of this fantastic event of the light streaming into the room, and also, in a way, unaware of that statue behind him displaying herself through the glass. For me, this is one of Wall's real masterpieces. I saw this painting for the first time at the 𝙨𝙪𝙨𝙙𝙪 Museum in Frankfurt in a wonderful small exhibition that they put on there, together with some Dutch painting for the comparison. And I was stunned by this. Again, if we had more time, I would show you certain abstract American paintings, like, for example, an Unfurled by Morris Louis, that seems to me to make a very interesting kind of comparison, almost analog with this, as if a representational photograph and a certain kind of abstract painting can be doing very similar kinds of artistic work. Anyway, for me, this is a quite magisterial painting by Wall. May I have, let's give you the next slide just to show you a detail of the young man, and also gives you a better sense of the suds on the window. And then, may I have the next slide, please? Just to show you some other Walls, and try to give you, just in the briefest possible way, a sense of his stake in the kinds of issues about theatricality and anti-theatricality that I talk about in my books and that go back to Art and Objecthood, this notorious essay of 1967. This is called Untitled Overpass. It's a large color transparency. And he made this in 2001. Again, this is not a candid photograph. Wall found these people. He probably auditioned for them. There were some decisions made about what clothing they're wearing, though undoubtedly they're wearing their own clothing so they would be comfortable. And he had them walk away from him, and he photographed until he got what he wanted. And indeed, this photograph, too, may be the result partly of a lot of computer work, combining different images to get exactly what he wants. It's a scene in Vancouver. What interests me about it, in terms of this talk, is the strategy of depicting figures walking away from the camera, walking away from the viewer. May I have the next slide, please? I'm going to show you a very beautiful lithograph by the great French painter 𝙨𝙪𝙨𝙪𝙨𝙪 Géricault. And you have in the museum in Lyon, a transcendently great portrait of a madwoman by Géricault from about 1820, 21. This is roughly the same moment. He was in England, and he does a great series of lithographs. This is called the Adelphi Wharf. And we have these horses and these men walking away from the viewer. In my version of Géricault, he is an intensely, indeed tragically anti-theatrical artist. And here you see exactly the same structure as Wall. I am not saying that what Wall is doing is quoting or alluding to the Géricault. The Wall is someone who studied the history of art, and he would surely have known the Géricault. What I'm trying to say is some of the problems Wall is dealing with are problems that have been around since the middle of the 18th century. I mean, my claim is that there is a huge amount of continuity and consistency between certain issues that arose in French painting and art criticism in the middle of the 18th century and what is at stake in some of the most interesting and challenging and best and ambitious art photography since the late 1970s. And there are issues that bear a close relation to the struggle, as I describe it, between high modernism and minimalism going back to the 60s. So for me, all of this is in play in this art. I mean, that's the point of a book like this. Just to show you just a little bit more, may I have the next slide? This will be a Wall. This is a very straightforward photograph that Wall made of a window, the outside of a window in his studio in Vancouver. And he calls this Blind Window, #1. He made it in 2000. And I want to take seriously the title, Blind Window. I mean, what is it that attracts Wall to a motif like this? Why does an artist like Wall, or any artist, why does he or she choose, right, the motifs that they choose? Well, for example, it turns out, and I I don't necessarily claim that this was, again, the conscious reason that he did it, but I don't think it's unimportant. Going right back to the 18th century, going right back to Chardin and Greuze and the great Bel Essai of David, the whole motif of blindness, and blindness as an index of unawareness of being beheld, is very central to French painting. May I have the next slide, please? One of the most important photographs of the 20th century by the American photographer Paul Strand, called Blind, made in 1916. It's an iconic photograph. It's the photograph more than any other that the American photographer Walker Evans said he saw when he was young and just beginning to photograph, and it just gave him the idea of what he could do in photography. Again, this incredibly powerful image of a blind person. And I'm suggesting that between a photograph like this and Wall making a photograph that he calls Blind Window, where a window is blocked in that way, there is something that continues. There is something that is analogous. And let me just show you one more photograph, Blind Window number 2 by Wall. This is the inside of that window. And here I want to say that we actually have a moment, a kind of frisson, before the photograph normalizes itself. We see it and we have a certain kind of experience, and then it becomes normal. But it would be as if he found a way to make a photograph that could give one the sense of blindness as if from within. Not just, as it were, the face seen from without, but as if it could be like what the experience of being blinded could be. So that's all I'm going to say about Wall here, but I hope it's enough to just give you a sense of the richness of just a tiny amount of the work with respect to these kinds of issues. May I have the next slide, please? I'm just going to make a big jump to the contemporary German photographer, today in his 50s, Thomas Struth, who was trained in the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf by Bernd and Hilla Becher. And we'll look a little bit at some work by the Bechers at the end of this talk. And Struth has done wonderful work in a number of veins, but this is a series of photographs that we could call his museum photographs. And he's made a series of different series of museum photographs. I'm going to call these the classic museum photographs, the first ones that he made, and I'm going to show you 3. This is the Musée du Louvre, number 4. That's how he numbers them, names them, where the museum was, and then what number of photograph it is that he made there. It's the Musée du Louvre 4, 1989, and it shows a group of tourists. And the more closely we look, we may think that most of them or all of them may, for example, be Japanese tourists. So we do get a certain sense of cultural difference between them and the painting they're looking at. And the painting they're looking at, of course, is the stupendous Radeau de la Méduse, the Raft of the Medusa, one of the greatest paintings in all of modern art, 1819, in which we see all these stricken figures on a raft. They have spent 2 weeks shipwrecked on a raft off the coast of Africa. There were 150 of them to begin with. There's now barely a dozen. It's a horrific story, and it's a moment where the figures on the raft who remain alive, almost all of them are struggling to be beheld, to be noticed by a ship which is a tiny speck on the far horizon, a British ship called the Argus. Later that day, in the real story, they will be rescued by that ship. But at this moment, the ship doesn't see them and sails past. And Géricault is asking us to imagine this extreme, sustained effort pour être vu, mais pour être vu par quelque chose qui reste at the limit of the space, as if the idea of this painting on Géricault's part is to show us figures who are struggling to be beheld by something way back in space, as if it is that effort that could rescue them from being beheld by us. In other words, this for me becomes one of the extreme works of the anti-theatrical tradition, as if to say that by 1819, the whole project of defeating theatricality had become so difficult, so appallingly difficult that only a solution as extreme as this, a shipwreck, madness, cannibalism, and then this huge effort to be beheld could, for the duration of the painting, right, rescue them from being beheld by us. I'm not saying for a minute, again, that Struth is aware of this particular structure, but for me it's fascinating that this picture should turn up in one of the museum pictures. And beyond that, I want to say that in the most interesting, the most successful of the museum pictures, and for me this is one of them, what the photography enables us to feel, and this is a claim, okay? This is an intuition, this is a claim. You may disagree. Right? But for me, my claim is that in the strongest of these pictures, we feel that there are something like two worlds. There's the world that the viewers are in, the museum goers, and then there's the world of the painting, and the figures in the painting inhabit another world. And this in itself amounts to something like a new solution to something like the problem of beholding, as if what photography can do, so the ontological, this is an example of what I want to call the kind of ontological work that photography can do, is show us a separation between the world of a painting and the world of viewers in a way that we would never see if we go to the museum itself. If I could transport us all right now, bodily, to the Louvre and stand in front of le radeau de la Méduse, and I said to you, look, those figures are in another world, what you ought to feel is you don't quite know what I'm saying. They're not in another world. They're on a painted surface in the same world as we are, if we're looking at it. But when we see a scene like this in a photograph, it's as if the work of the photograph is to make a difference between the world of the viewers and the world of the figures in front of it. May I have the next slide, Giovanni, just to show you another? This is the Art Institute of Chicago, number 2, 1990. The painting that we're focusing on is Gustave Caillebott's Paris Street, rainy day from the very late 1870s. And again, I want to make the same claim here, that despite the fact, or you might say all the more evidently, it's dramatized by the fact that these viewers in the painting seem as if, Caillebott has wanted to make them seem as if they're about to step out of the painting into our space. And the figure at the right, whom we see from the rear in the painting, has just entered the painting from our space. The photograph makes us feel all the more intensely the absolute divide between the world, the space of the painting, and the space of the viewers. Let me just show you one more museum painting. This is the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, number 3, 1989. And here, I think he's driving the point very hard by showing these two Rembrandt portraits and then this man who looks so closely at them. The German art historian Hans Belting has written about all these pictures, and for me, Belting gets it exactly wrong. Belting sees this man as the figures in the painting as entering into a conversation with this man. You know, to me, that is exactly wrong. Despite how close the man goes, despite how intimately he's looking, what I sense is they're inhabiting a world quite different from his. Let me move on. I warned you that this was going to be rapid. Struth also, it turns out to be the case that the art photography of the ambitious photography of the last 30 years turns out to be very, very interested in the genre of the portrait. In a way, it's surprising. But one reason I think that the portrait emerges, I want to say re-emerges as a subject of great interest to ambitious photographers is precisely because, again and again in portraits, the sitter is looking directly at the camera, looking directly out of the photograph. In that sense, is going to be aware of being photographed. Again and again in the history of art or literature or culture, artists find themselves drawn to subjects, situations, dispositifs, which present a maximum challenge, right, to the emerging imperative of an art at a particular moment. The very fact that something like, I want to say, defeating theatricality emerges in this photography is so important, is something that is going to draw certain photographers to a kind of subject matter that might seem to make that defeating of theatricality impossible. Struth's family portraits, which I think which are often quite wonderful, are a perfect example of this. So this is the Hirose family in Hiroshima, a photograph that he made from 1987. And there's a number of things that have been said about Struth and how the family photographs work. He generally chooses families he knows very well. He may even have stayed with them. He talks with them. They agree to the making of the photograph. They then participate in the making of the photograph. They choose together the lieu in the house or the apartment where it will be made. They set up the limits of the field. And then the family takes the positions that they want to take. And Struth stands alongside his camera, not behind his camera, but alongside his camera. And as they present themselves to the camera, he may take 20 or 30 photographs in a given day. He may come back another day. And then he will look at the photographs and sometimes even together with the family, choose the one that seems to him to work. He describes what he's looking for as trying to find the photograph in which everyone in the photograph is as present as possible, right, to the camera. And again, he would think of it as present to the camera, not to him. Partly what's involved for him in standing to the side of the camera is that they are not looking at him, they are looking at the camera. There's something else, though. I mean, you could say that they are all absorbed in or engaged in presenting themselves to the camera. They have agreed to do this. But I think part of the logic of these photographs and the logic that the photographs enable us to feel is that the very intensity of their commitment to that, to something like manifesting themselves, means that they are necessarily unaware of their relationships to one another. Their relationships to one another, even at the limit, the total configuration that they make, is something that is under the sign of the non-intended, just something that came into being. That's what the photographs, I want to say, make us feel. We feel as if there are two axes, one a kind of axis of presentation and the other an axis of relationship. And the axis of relationship feels anti-theatrical in the sense also that no one in the photograph could see that. You can really get a sense of this if you compare the photographs of the different families. So this is the Hirose family in Hiroshima. Let me move next to the Smith family in Fife. You know, just a completely different, you could say a completely different cultural world, a completely different feeling of existence, but a wholly different set of relationships among the figures. They want more distance between themselves. And then we will make one more leap to the Bernstein family in Mundelsbach of 1990. Something else you'll notice in the most interesting of the family photographs is, and it's something obviously that Struth was interested in, though I don't know in what terms he thought about it, but he's very interested, you can feel this, right? In this photograph, you can feel it very powerfully. He's interested in the fact of family resemblance. He's interested in biological resemblance, right? And one way of thinking of biological resemblance in a family is, I mean, what's of interest in it in this context? What's of interest in it is it's obviously something that cannot be intended by the members of the family. They just happen to look alike. So that too is on the side of the inconscient, the non-voulu, okay? As opposed to their presenting themselves to the camera to be photographed. In other words, I'm suggesting that in the most successful of the family photographs, again, we're getting a complicated but specifiable relationship to these sorts of issues. I'll say just one other thing. It's, Giovanni, yeah, let's go back. I'll say just one other thing about this. It's only photography that could do this. If a painter offered us a painting, and sometimes painters do this, in which we get a strong sense of family resemblance among the figures, we never know for sure whether it's the family or whether it's the painter who just makes figures look the same. Right? If you look at 𝙨𝙪𝙨𝙦, well, anytime everybody in 𝙨𝙪𝙨 looks like 𝙨𝙪𝙨's sisters. Right? It's just a very strong drive in him. Whereas we see it in a photograph, we tend to trust it. Let me just show you a few other portraits. Could I have the next, Giovanni, again? So this is the Dutch photographer Rinneke Dijkstra. And here we're getting something like that same structure in just a single figure. On the one hand, this young girl, and she's very drawn to, in a wonderful series of photographs of young adolescents on beaches. And she gets them to pose for her 4x5-inch camera, and they agree to it, they present themselves. And what fascinates her is what the American photographer Diane Arbus once called the gap between intention and effect. On the one hand, they are presenting themselves. On the other hand, as Arbus says, you can't control everything. So you feel all the automatisms, all the awkwardnesses, all the pieces of behavior that this person could not be aware of. It's a mark of Dijkstra's photographs. Unlike Arbus's photographs, she's very gentle towards her sitters. She could say she loves her sitters. She doesn't have a certain kind of, it's not complicated in the way that Arbus's photographs are. In some ways, that makes her photographs less interesting, less rich than Arbus's. But again, what I'm trying to bring out is the combination here of the self-presentation, which is on the side of a certain kind of intentionality and consciousness of being viewed, but precisely by virtue of that, also this emergence of everything that could not be intended, could not be offered to be seen by the sitter in the photograph. May I have another, the next slide, just to show a very different kind of portrait. This is one of the large portraits that Thomas Roof made in the 1980s of friends, fellow students, and others. The photograph itself is, I think, something like 7 feet high, so you get a real sense of it here. And here it's completely not like the Struth, it's not like the Dijkstra. We're not meant to somehow empathize or enter into the photograph. It's a whole other alternative relationship to the viewer. I would say it's a relationship of facing and impassiveness and exclusion and establishing the viewer at a distance from the photograph. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But it's also to say that throughout this book, I'm trying to show all the different strategies that photographers follow with respect to the central issue of the relationship of the work to the viewer. To show one more portrait, this is from a book that I like very much by the photographer Luc Delahaye, who is here today. It's a book called, a photo book called 𝙩𝙁𝙁, and they're photographs, they're black and white photographs made at extremely close range in something like exactly the same cadre, exactly the same format, on the metro with a hidden camera during, I think, something like a 2-year period, maybe 1995 to 97. And organized in the book, the photographs are on the right-hand page of the book. The left-hand page in each case is black. And you, in a way, you activate the book by turning through it, and you see photograph after photograph of people taken in this way. And the sort of argument of the book, the theoretical argument of the book, is something like people on the metro are themselves trying to be, in some sense, not present, to achieve something like a kind of psychic absence surrounded by all these other people. And the photographs are meant to capture something like this sense of, I'm not here. And in the context of the kind of arguments I'm putting forward, this in itself becomes a relation to a kind of anti-theatrical ideal within photography. I'm not saying that the notion of anti-theatricality per se is something that was in Luc's mind, but you then have to ask yourself, why was a photographer like Luc drawn to a subject precisely because it seemed to be a series, if it worked, it would be a series of people trying to be psychically absent from the situation in which he's capturing them. Decisive for him, early photograph of his called Klausenpass from 1984, in a sense his career as a photographer we know begins in 1984, and it begins with this photograph. And the story of the photograph is the idea that he was in Switzerland, and I think supposedly some friend of his even said to him, well, take a photograph of that hillside for me, and he took the photograph. And afterwards, back in Düsseldorf, when he developed the photograph and blew it up to a certain size, he was suddenly able to see that there were all these little figures who were climbing over that hillside, figures that he didn't notice when he made the photograph. And I think then Gursky had the intelligence, really the kind of brilliance to see that something was happening here that he could build on. And what was happening was the idea of the ability of the photographic apparatus, the lens, the machine, the camera, the film, its ability to register distance, to treat subjects that could be very distant, but do it in a way that was very, very clear. Right? The technology allowed it. And the interest of that, the further, I mean, so what is interesting about that? What's interesting about the fact that we see these tiny people at a hillside? Why should that matter artistically? Why should that count artistically? I mean, that would be the question. That's the question that, in a sense, Gursky would have to, in some sense, in practice, solve for himself. But for anyone writing about Gursky, it's what one has to answer. And I think, for me, the answer turns out to be something like this, that in a photograph like this, with this kind of extraordinary sense of distance in it, we sense a kind of inequality, a kind of non-reciprocalness between ourselves looking at the photograph and imagining even Gursky looking at the scene and even photographing the scene and these tiny figures in the scene. It's as if they are so far away that we sense intuitively that they would not be able to see us.